August 1945. The air in Japan still carried the scent of smoke and surrender as Allied forces moved across the Pacific to gather prisoners. Trucks rumbled through towns under occupation, their canvas flaps flapping in the damp, hot wind. Among those taken were not only soldiers, but also women nurses, support staff, and civilians caught in military zones. For them, captivity was not defined by shackles or barbed wire, but by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Witnesses remember those early hours as eerily quiet. Footsteps crunched on gravel. Prisoners kept their gaze forward, refusing to show weakness. Some held small cloth bags, the few possessions they were allowed to bring. Others had nothing but their weariness. By the war's end, nearly 2.7 million Japanese troops had surrendered, and among them were women captured in places like Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. For these women, surrender was not the end. It was the start of a deeper kind of suffering. From the Allied perspective, the first surprise came swiftly. Food, bread, canned milk, even soap began to appear in the camps. Things the Japanese military had failed to provide for months. One nurse later confessed that the enemy gave them better meals than their own commanders ever had. It created a confusing mix of emotions, kindness, wrapped in the cold reality of defeat. Yet beneath this uneasy balance, a more intimate struggle was about to unfold. Among these women, one thing held deep significance: their long black hair. In Japanese culture at the time, hair was more than beauty. It was pride, femininity, and even a quiet promise of loyalty. As Allied guards observed the prisoners, rumors spread of a ritual meant not to kill, but to crush spirit. The women didn't know it yet, but their identity was about to be taken from them, not by weapons, but by blades. At night, the camps fell silent. The only sound the creaking of metal gates closing. Behind those fences, fear took a new shape. What form would the degradation take? They prepared for the worst, but no one expected it to begin with something so personal, so obvious as their hair. And here, where silence and pride still held their ground, the story sharpens into its most unsettling act of control. September 1945. The morning light sliced through the wire fences as prisoners were ordered to gather. Boots thudded across the dirt, and in the guards' hands, something unexpected gleamed: not rifles, not clubs, but scissors. The women were lined up, their shadows stretching long and unsteady across the ground. Confusion rippled through the rows. For soldiers, punishment might mean hard labor. For these women, the order was simpler, harsher. Their hair had to be removed. Witnesses described the first cut like a sudden crack. A young nurse froze as a guard pulled her braid taut. With one swift motion, the scissors sliced through, and the long black rope dropped lifelessly to the earth. Gasps spread, hands flew to heads. Some tried to shield themselves, but there was no choice. The guards moved down the line, one after another, the blades scraping against skin. In under an hour, dozens of women were left with bare scalps. What made it worse was the silence. No shouted orders, no mocking words, just the steady snip of metal through hair. One Allied soldier later recalled the strange mood. They didn't resist. They simply watched their hair fall. For the captives, each strand was not just hair, but years of identity, tradition, and culture, torn away in seconds. Exact numbers are hard to confirm, but reports suggest that in some towns, groups of 30 to 40 women were lined up in a single day for this act. It wasn't random. It spread through camps across Southeast Asia in a methodical way. The message was unmistakable. Their bodies, their pride, no longer theirs. From an enemy viewpoint, it was a form of dominance. In one recovered diary entry, a prisoner wrote, They saw us as prizes, not people. Asterisk. To the women, the shame cut deeper than hunger, deeper than imprisonment. Their braids, now piled on the ground, looked like victims of a war that still wasn't over. When the line finally ended, the earth was littered with thick strands. Black waves tangled in the dust. Women shuffled away, hands pressed against their exposed heads, some whispering prayers, others too stunned to speak. The pile of hair remained, a disturbing reminder of defeat. As the wind picked up, strands scattered across the camp. A new image burned into memory. Humiliation made visible, impossible to ignore. The afternoon sun grew hotter as the ritual ended, but the real shock was on the ground. The parade area was now covered with heaps of severed hair, long braids, some tied with faded ribbons, others roughly cut and jagged at the ends. A breeze lifted strands into the air, drifting like remnants of a fire that wasn't real. For the prisoners, the battlefield was no longer about bullets and explosions. It was their own heads, reflected in the dirt. Women bent down instinctively, trying to gather the pieces, pressing them against their scalps as if the hair could grow back. But guards shouted at them to stand, pushing them away from the growing mound. Witnesses said the sound of the scissors still echoed in their ears, like phantom blades slicing skin. Some women claimed a stinging sensation, though there was no blood. It was the burn of shame, not steel. Records vary, but historians believe that in the final months of 1945, up to 300 women were subjected to this forced haircut across occupied regions. For many, it felt worse than starvation. Hunger gnawed slowly, quietly. This was immediate, public, undeniable. A diary fragment captures it plainly. Asterisk. It felt worse than hunger. I would rather starve than be seen this way. Asterisk. The air smelled of sweat and rusted metal. Guards shoveled some of the hair into bags, while other piles were left to scatter underfoot and wind. To the women, each strand held memories, childhood, promises, family customs now trampled into the dirt. Nothing about it seemed accidental. The ritual was meant to mark them, to make them stand out as defeated, powerless. From the captor's view, it worked. Bald heads became like red marks, removing any chance of anonymity. Escape or blending in with villages was no longer possible. Locals could identify them at a glance. Shaved heads, announcing times prisoner, disgraced, beaten, asterisk. That was the goal. By evening, the prisoners returned to their barracks, hands nervously touching their scalps, but the hair stayed scattered across the open ground like a grotesque harvest. And as night settled, a new ordeal awaited. Soon, they would be forced out in public, their cropped heads displayed in the streets where shame would become a spectacle. October 1945. The morning call came without explanation. Guards ordered the women out of the camp and onto the road, their heads still tender from the shaving. Villagers gathered quickly. Farmers stopped working. Children pushed forward. Elders stood in silence. What they saw wasn't enemy soldiers or chained captives, but women with unevenly cut scalps, made to march in formation through familiar streets. The humiliation became public theater. The sounds were unsettling. Some villagers whispered, others laughed. Children pointed, mimicking scissors with their hands. A few women from nearby towns looked away, refusing to take part in the display. But the collective shame weighed heavier than any chains. For the prisoners, every step on the cobbled roads felt like walking through fire. The shaved head wasn't just a sign of loss, it was a stigma that couldn't be hidden. Historians note that in several towns across Asia, similar parades were held, with dozens of women forced to walk in front of their own people. Allied troops believed it sent a message. Loyalty to the fallen empire would be remembered, punished, and shown. The prisoners became unwilling signs of defeat, their bodies used as warnings. Enemy voices revealed the raw pain. One Japanese nurse later said, "We looked like outcasts, though our only fault was being captured. The shaved heads made us seem foreign to our own people, stripped of womanhood, stripped of home." Asterisk. Unlike hunger or forced labor, this wound was out in the open, carried into every glance and every cruel laugh. The contrast was painful. These women had once worn their long hair neatly braided under their caps, a symbol of order and pride. Now, without it, they marched as proof of collapse. Shame clung to them more tightly than their worn uniforms. For those watching, the show served its purpose. It dehumanized. It silenced. Few could see them as fellow citizens anymore. When the march ended, the women were returned to camp, faces hot, heads down. The silence that followed was deeper than any shouting could have been. For them, humiliation wasn't a one-time event. It was a cycle, renewed every time they stepped outside. Yet, within the camp's barbed wire, a strange contradiction was growing. The very people who had taken their dignity were also the ones feeding them better than their own leaders ever had. November 1945. Inside the fences, after the public displays, life settled into an odd contradiction. The women, their heads unevenly cropped, lined up for food they hadn't seen in years. White bread, canned milk, tins of Spam stacked on tables like cargo from a ship. For those who had survived on thin rice, gruel, and dried roots, this sudden plenty felt unreal. Historians estimate that the U.S. military distributed 15 million rations daily across occupied areas, each averaging 3,200 calories, far more than Japan's wartime ration of barely 1,800. Women who had grown thin and pale now felt the shock of abundance. For the first time in years, their stomachs were full, sometimes uncomfortably so. Some later wrote that they tasted milk for the first time in their lives. Not just a drink, but a sign of a world built on production, not scarcity. The contrast was sharp. Outside the camp, villagers still waited for scraps. Inside, prisoners ate more than their families back home could imagine. It brought guilt, even disbelief, one auxiliary remembered. "We ate like queens of hunger, to the captives." This contradiction cut deeper than the haircut. The enemy that had humiliated them in public was also keeping them alive with resources Japan had failed to deliver. The camps were basic tar paper huts, straw mats, shared latrines, but hygiene rules were strict. Soap, rare in Japan, was given out. Showers ran cold but steady. Women who had lived in filth during retreats now washed every day, forced into routines that felt strange yet oddly comforting. The conflict was mental. Shame marked them in public, yet survival was ensured by those same captors. At mealtimes, silence spoke volumes. Heads bent, food eaten quickly, eyes avoiding one another. They were prisoners, but healthier than before. Their own officers had demanded loyalty, but left them hungry. The enemy took their dignity, but gave them bread. For many, the contradiction became unbearable. Who was the real enemy, and who had truly failed them? As days passed, the weight of their bald heads mixed with the shock of full stomachs. In that imbalance, something inside them broke. Survival was real, but identity was slipping away. And in that fragile reflection, seeing themselves alive but unrecognizable, the deeper pain of captivity began. December 1945. The camp huts were cold, their thin walls rattling against winter winds. Inside, The women huddled close, not for warmth, but to avoid the mirrors. Every camp had a few cracked glass nailed above basins or leaning against posts. For those who looked, the reflection hurt more than hunger. Shaved heads, hollow cheeks, eyes that didn't seem to belong to them. Their long black hair had been more than appearance. It was memory, culture, self-worth. Now it was gone. Testimonies show the mental toll was severe. Some women refused to speak for days after the haircut. Others wrapped cloth around their heads, desperate to hide the exposed skin. The short hair made them feel less like women, less like people. Historians note cases of deep depression, with some women falling into silence. In rare but tragic cases, suicide followed within weeks. The dissonance was intense. Their bodies were growing stronger, fed well, but their minds were unraveling. A diary entry found later said simply, asterisk, "We have no country, no face, no name, asterisk." To be alive, yet stripped of identity, was a punishment worse than confinement. The guards may not have noticed the collapse, but the women felt it in every movement. Some covered their heads with blankets even during the day. Others avoided looking at each other, ashamed to be seen. Where once they had braided each other's hair in quiet solidarity, now they sat apart, hands idle, silence heavier than the fences. Numbers tell only part of the story. Allied records listed prisoners as healthy calories were sufficient. Hygiene improved, but the files never captured the invisible wounds. For these women, survival came at the cost of self. Shaved heads became symbols of erasure, marks that labeled them not just as defeated auxiliaries, but as women stripped of their very essence. December's cold only deepened the emptiness. Nights were long, and whispers often broke the stillness. Questions about family, about whether they'd be recognized upon return. The mirror, once a daily tool, had become an enemy. And yet, just as hopelessness seemed complete, a small, unexpected act of kindness arrived, one that hinted, however faintly, at healing. January 1946. The new year came not with celebration, but with frost on the camp fences. One morning, as the women lined up for inspection, a figure approached an Allied nurse in a neat uniform, carrying a bundle of cloth. At first, the prisoners stiffened, expecting another order, another humiliation. But the nurse reached into the bundle and handed out scarves, cotton, plain but soft. For women whose heads were still raw with shame, it felt like a lifeline. The prisoners hesitated. Some held the fabric without moving. Others quickly wrapped it around their scalps, relief washing over their faces. For weeks, they had avoided mirrors. Now, covered in patterned cloth, they looked at each other again. It wasn't beauty restored, but it was dignity pieced back together. Records show the Red Cross sent over 11,000 care packages to prisoner camps across Asia in 1946. Food, clothes, medical supplies. Among them, small things like scarves, soap, and bandages carried meaning beyond their weight. For the women, the scarf was more than fabric. It was protection, a symbol, a chance at recovery. One prisoner later recalled, asterisk, "Strange, that kindness came from the enemy." Asterisk. The contradiction grew sharper. The same system that had stripped them bare now allowed moments of compassion. The scarf gave not just warmth against the winter wind, but a way to face each other without shame. Within days, scarves became part of daily life. Women traded them, folded them neatly, tied them with care. In the absence of hair, these cloths became new identities. Quiet defiance woven in cotton. For the first time in months, smiles appeared, fragile but real. Small laughter returned when a scarf slipped off in the wind, and another helped tie it tighter. Humanity, long buried under shame, began to surface. This act didn't erase the past. The hair was still gone, the scars still there. But in a camp where despair had become routine, the gesture mattered. It showed that cruelty wasn't the only language of war, and it opened a possibility. If the enemy could offer mercy, even in small ways, perhaps survival could mean more than just enduring. That idea grew as freedom approached. Spring 1946, the gates opened for return. Trucks waited outside the camps, their canvas covers flapping in the warm air. The women, heads still covered in scarves, lined up again, but this time not for punishment. Release had come. Their steps were careful, burdened by months of captivity, yet different from when they first entered. Each carried wounds, but some also carried mementos. The very scarves given in January, folded carefully, held close to their hearts like treasures. Historians note that by mid-1946, over 90% of Japanese prisoners across Asia had been repatriated. For the women, leaving was not triumph, but a mix of emotions. They climbed onto the trucks, glancing back at the huts where they had suffered and, in an odd way, survived. To go home was relief, but also confusion. Who would they be when they returned? Would their families recognize them not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually? Testimonies capture the bitterness and gratitude. One former prisoner said she never forgave the haircut, but she kept the scarf her whole life. It became a strange relic born from shame, saved because of mercy. These contradictions shaped their memories. The trucks carried them away from the fences, but the wounds traveled inside, stitched deep into their sense of self. The journey back to Japan revealed a stark contrast. Food on Allied ships was still plentiful: white bread, canned fruit, hot soup served in metal bowls. Meanwhile, news trickled in that Tokyo and Osaka were still struggling. Children dug for sweet potatoes in fields. Survival in the enemy's camps had been bitterly ironic, better fed by conquerors than by their own failing empire. Reflections from the time echo this change. A returned nurse admitted, "We entered as soldiers, left as ghosts, but with strange memories of kindness." That sentence captures their experience. Dignity lost, identity broken, but humanity complicated by unexpected care. The scarf became a metaphor, something fragile, covering wounds without erasing them. As Japan's coastline appeared on the horizon, the women held their keepsakes tighter. They were returning not as heroes, but as survivors, carrying stories too complex to tell easily. And once they stepped onto their homeland, a new silence began. The silence of memory buried, of voices silenced in the rush to rebuild. Japan was reconstructing, cities rising from ruins, families trying to mend lives shattered by war. For the women who came back from captivity, silence became a way to survive. Their hair grew back, falling again in long black waves, hiding the most obvious mark of their suffering. But beneath the surface, scars remained. Most never spoke of what happened. Not to husbands, not to children. The shame of the shaved heads, the memory of the scissors, was locked away. Historians searching years later found only fragments, diaries hidden in wooden boxes, a few whispered interviews. Estimates suggest fewer than 5% of female prisoner accounts survived in official records, compared to the vast documentation of male soldiers. The silence was intentional. In a society focused on rebuilding pride, there was no room for stories of women stripped bare in camps, marched through towns, later wrapped in borrowed cloth. Enemy records tell the rest. Allied reports listed food supplies, medical checks, daily numbers, but rarely mentioned the humiliation rituals. What for the captors was a routine act of control became for the women the deepest wound of all. One survivor later admitted in private asterisk, "We never spoke again of Sysis." Asterisk. That single line captures the gap between lived pain and public memory. The legacy lives not in archives, but in absence. Families wondered why mothers avoided mirrors, why they folded scarves so carefully, why they startled at the sound of scissors. For children born in post-war Japan, these habits became unexplained, rituals passed down without words. Only much later, as historians gathered testimonies, did the full picture emerge: survival tangled with shame, mercy mixed with suffering. By the late 1940s, the women had reintegrated into society. Hair grew long, photos showed smiles, but their silence lasted for decades. In many ways, that silence became the longest prison, stronger than fences, heavier than gates. The humiliation had lasted minutes, the silence a lifetime, and that is the haunting truth of their story. Dignity can be lost in the time it takes for scissors to close, but silence can last for generations.